Okay. First of all, I just want to tell everybody happy Thanksgiving. My kids all know this. The Thanksgiving holiday is my favorite by far, even more than Christmas. It's just a time to like formalize. Hopefully, you always have kind of a gratitude mindset, but it's an opportunity to just formalize it and be grateful for the things we have, the things that we do. I'm gonna just share something. I've shared this with a few of you. Anytime I find myself complaining, especially if I complain in front of my kids, I quickly get a reminder, and it's something along the lines of, "Oh, Dad, first world problems." And I love the sarcasm of my kids. I taught them well. But all joking aside, when you look at some, and that's not to say we don't from time to time deal with significant things. Life is full of great times and there are times of tragedy, and I'm not trying to diminish those, but as a general mindset, I just want you to think about this. This morning, did you wake up in a nice warm bed and then have to wonder, wow, I wonder where I'm going to get some drinking water today? Do I have to walk 5 miles with a thing on my head to go get some, wait in line at a well and get some water? Do you have indoor plumbing so you can take a shower or take care of biological needs without figuring out if and when you can do such things? Is food 2 minutes away from your house? So it goes back to my kid's statement. Just remember, if outside of the real tragic things of life, if you just find yourself complaining about a little bit of this, that, and the other, just channel the Barton kids and just say, wow, is this really a first world problem I'm dealing with here? And it kind of puts things in perspective. And with that, I hope we really do understand. I listen to a lot of podcasts and Audible books, and it's kind of funny. I think we get a little complacent sometimes with our lives. It's just kind of human nature. It's not because we're bad people, but we just get some complacency. But tell you what, you talk to some different immigrants or people who have made their way here and are enjoying some of the things we have, and there's a whole different sense of gratitude. So we're lucky. We're in a great occupation. We get to look at the people you get to work with. Well, aside from Parker, just kidding you, Parker. It's Monday morning. Parker is a longtime dear friend, and I'm grateful for his relationship over what almost 20 years now.
I'm grateful for Parker too, because normally I'm the butt of that joke. So I'm glad that Parker's here so he can take the shrapnel.
It should be said that I sit next to Matt or to Matt in our office, and let me tell you, it is hard. It is not easy.
It is not easy. Yeah. If Nancy was on the call, she'd be like, let's talk. All right, let's get underway. One last thing. The old saying, and it really is true, and you really ought to try this experiment. If you have anxiety, depression, fear, try and go through and write down a list of 10, 20 things you're grateful for. And psychologists have proven this. It's like impossible for fear, anxiety, doubt, things like that to exist in the same space when there's gratitude. I think it's because it adds to perspective and you realize you actually have some things pretty good. All right, off the pulpit. Any quick wins from the group over the past week? Anything? Nothing. Wow. You guys need to get out and work more.
Look, I think
got one for you if you need it.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
I have a couple clients that have picked up the ball after having that discussion that many of you probably have had about they want to wait for interest rates to drop. They want to wait for the new president to be in office. They want to wait for something. And then, of course, they get reminded that when something drops, something else goes up, and that's prices. And so now they're moving much faster.
Mike, I'm actually so glad you brought that up because this is what I've been talking about. I'll put it loosely in a category of a 4 to a 6 month pivot. The ones that your clients are smart, they're figuring it out now, right? Stuff is still not flying off the shelf, but there's also not gobs of inventory. There's a decent level of inventory. We're about 20% lower than our historical norms. You all know that, right? We're about 20% lower than where we should be historically. But rates have come down at the Fed level, but because some of the recent reports on inflation have kind of upticked a little bit, there, the lending space is very good at future pacing, and they're like, wow, if we get another month's worth of report of inflation or unemployment drops or some of those indicators, what they do in their mind, and I'm painting with a very broad brush, is they say, oh, the Fed's not going to have a lot of need to drop rates any further. I'm going to share some data with you a little later in the presentation that'll kind of show you. I think we're still on a pretty good track to pull back on rates for the next 6 months. It may not happen as fast as we want, and the lending market will be a little nervous until they see another Fed drop before it really materializes in something noticeable and significant in the lender space. So just know that, right? And people hear tidbits of information. They hear, well, the Fed rate dropped. How come mortgage rates didn't come down a quarter point? And it's important for us. You don't need to be a macro or a micro economist, but all of us can say there's correlation between what the Fed does and rates, but the timing of the market or the lending space catching up with the Fed isn't always direct. So let's get you under contract. We've got, a 30 or a 40-day lock. Things are going to continue to improve. The good news is, if you're using lifetime home loans and we need to relock, we have 20 different lenders that we can relock you on rates. That is a huge, I hope that's like sinking in. That is a huge benefit and advantage for your client pool. Because if they go to American First Credit Union or some local bank and they lock a rate, they're locked. And if rates improve, there's not a whole lot they can do other than walk away. Did any of that make sense? Because all you're looking kind of like with a blank stare, so it's cool. All right. Parker, did you have one? Muted.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, I was having dinner with Lauren the other night and she goes, wow, your winter's really picking up. You always seem to do really well in the winter time. And historically, that's true. I actually sell a lot more over the winter than I do sometimes in the summer. And she started to ask why. And I just went back to what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, Matt. Like wintertime is the time where you crank up and you steal market share from everybody else. So by the time the summer comes, they have no idea what's going on with the marketplace, but you're fully educated and aware. And just kind of like you were saying, Mike, you take that opportunity to utilize that data and find a way to tell that in a story to the consumer, and it allows your business to continue to go in an upward trajectory. And I think that's great. So,
listen, if we were in some other industry, I don't care what it is, but we were in sales, and I, as your manager, said, "Hey,
I'm available.
The next 3 months, 4 months, 30% to 40% of your competition is going to go away." As a salesperson, would you be jacked up? Yeah, of course you would. It's a time to kill it. Well, guess what? I can show you historically, year after year after year, that is kind of the case. And in case you're not aware, Utah is one of the youngest, if not the youngest, states in the United States, which means there's a lot of kids in school. What happens at Christmas? There's a Christmas break, right?
I can tell you what happens.
If somebody needs to move, I promise you, that is a target date on their calendar. We get 2 weeks, we can get things packed up and move into the new house, and we're not having to worry about that is a target time, and we always see a bump in sales in the December timeframe.
To add to that, credit cards go skyrocket in the wintertime, right? We're already at the highest debt for credit cards than we've ever been in the United States. But that's not going to stop people from ensuring that they buy things. America likes things. And as they buy things to fill their house, they realize, I need a bigger house. And that thought typically happens at about January 10th.
Yeah.
Or they start to go, let's go.
Now, listen, I want to temper Parker's fear mongering in regards to debt. I'm going to actually show us, Parker, I want you to remind me later when I get to my slide deck to show you an interesting slide on debt, from mortgage to auto to revolving lines of credit to student loans. It's actually going to blow your mind a little bit. Okay. All right, let's get into it. DOJ. If you're not paying attention to, I'm going to pull something up here. 2 seconds. Share my screen. All right. This came out today. NAR raises issues with the NAR deal. If you're not paying attention, the deal is supposed to be finalized with the judge on the 26th, Dan. That's in 2 days. And of course, the DOJ, almost like a little bit of a spoiled child, or a spoiler at least, weighs in, and they sent notice to the judge, kind of giving their preferences, just so you understand. They don't get to call the shots. The judge does. And kind of with a change, listen, I don't care what your political affiliation, there's going to be a change in administration. And I'm going to paint with a very broad brush. The incoming administration, love them, hate them, don't care, in regards to our industry, is going to be a little more fair market, not so overbearing. And so a lot of this that I'm going to share with you here on screen may literally mean nothing, but I think it's important to share it anyway. So basically, in a nutshell, if you look at the highlighted things, it says, well, isn't taking an official position, the DOJ, because they really can't, and they don't really, it's up to the judge. They want the judge to make clear that the deal won't stop future enforcement over antitrust violations. Now, listen, I want to just share one little thing. Do you know who, well, for time, I'm not going to go there. So then you get down to the second paragraph, and it says, the statement, meaning from the DOJ, asks that if the court approves the settlement in 2 days, it should clarify that using these new NAR policies does not shield NAR or other potential defendants from future enforcement by the DOJ. So stop there. I actually agree with this statement, but it's not so much the DOJ. The whole reason why the DOJ got involved was why? Well, because there was a class action lawsuit that led to 10 other class action lawsuits, and pretty soon NAR went to the government and said, this is ridiculous. We got to get our heads wrapped around this. Let's get a national settlement so we can do away with these class action suits. My point here is, I've said this probably since I was doing training on the national settlement, is this is round one. Once you kind of open Pandora's box, there will be other class action attorneys looking for opportunities to file class action suits, because the recipe has already been tried out. And so when we, as a company, talk about, hey, there's certain things you should not put, for instance, in the ERS, don't put in section 2.2, how much we're going to offer out by way of compensation, right? That whole section is about the seller authorizing us to offer out compensation up to the agreed upon amount with the seller. Don't put negotiable. It kind of defeats the purpose of the section, right? The whole point of that section was to have absolute clarity as to what the seller would be obligated to pay if we signed a brokerage compensation agreement. When you put negotiable, it creates a cloud, it creates ambiguity, which opens the door for somebody to say the public is being harmed because it's not clear to them what the costs are going to be. Okay, so that's just one simple example that where we could go sideways in round 2 or in round 3. So when we recommend something, when we manage to something in the company, know it's with a mindset of we're looking down the path to see where the next level of exposure is going to be. We're not just doing arbitrary, capricious things to make your life tough. I hope everybody understands that. Okay. All right. Then the last part, a warning from the DOJ. The agency also raised concerns. I love this one. You can't make this stuff up. This is real life. The agency also raised a concern about buyer agent agreement, saying the provision that requires buyers and agents to make written agreements before home tours may harm buyers and limit how brokers compete for clients. I mean, there's so many different pathways I could go on this in addition to contradicting state laws and everything else and full disclosure. I mean, that's almost like if I was to, that's like taking the truth in lending that you get from a lender, right? And say, oh, well, since, you're doing that and having them sign off that they, here's what the potential costs are, that's anti-competitive. My mind just like, this is why I'm not a fan of a lot of government. You have to have some, but I'm not a fan of a lot of it. Anyway, so just know, because I've already seen 3 different news outlets carry stories about this morning, that, oh my gosh, there's a real concern with the NAR deal. I just want to set your mind at ease. The NAR or DOJ doesn't get to call the shot. The judge, for all intents and purposes, will probably approve this, and we'll be under our way. And the later section about buyer agency agreements, I think with a change in administration, is probably going to be a nothing burger. That's just my mildly educated guess. Okay. All right. That was loads of fun. Second thing I wanted to cover with you, and now I need to bring up my PDFs. Let's go. Okay. We're all familiar with deals, and they're pretty common right now, right? Where you have a buyer who wants to buy, and there's not a ton of, for our sellers, there's not a lot of buyers beating down the door to buy properties right now. And so quite often we're getting this section in a REPC, right? It is the subject to sell. And I want to highlight and quickly go through the underlying portions, because we know this section is here, but I don't know that agents have always read this and understand that there's a lot packed into this little paragraph. Buyer's ability to purchase the property, as referenced in section 2.1C above, and or, that's an important legal phrase there, and or any portion of the cash referenced in section 2.1E is or is not conditioned upon the sale of real estate owned by the buyer, right? I've had other agents and even brokers say, well, they had the majority of the money, blah, blah, blah. That's not what this says. It says if you're getting anything from the sale of a property to buy this property, what does it say? The term, this last portion, the terms of the attached subject to sell buyer property addendum apply. It's not a, oh, if you include the addendum, it's a mandate. If you check in the affirmative, you're to attach the subject to sell buyer's property addendum. Is everybody 100% clear with that? Because we still sometimes get this, and it usually, where it shows up for me as a broker is well down the path, and you're trying to cancel and somebody lets slip, well, we didn't get our home sold, and there was never, this box was never checked is, and there's definitely not the addendum. And all of a sudden the other side is getting squirrely and kind of ticked that this wasn't disclosed. Is there a case there for liability and damages for the party? Yeah, there really is. They took their house off the market. They would have, that perhaps they forewent another buyer who was qualified, but you offered a couple $1,000s more and you didn't disclose that you had to sell a home. And much later down the road, after buyer number 1 went away, you let fly, oh yeah, we can't close on time, or we can't close at all because we couldn't sell our house. And everybody's like, what? You can't sell your what? You didn't check section 2.2. So this is a big deal. It's a big deal. And it happens in real life because I've dealt with it several times in the past several months. All right, so that's just the kickoff point. All right, I'm gonna pick on somebody. D, you're looking sharp this morning, therefore I'm gonna pick on you. All right, in a typical situation, if a buyer puts forward an offer like this and says, hey, D, we really want to buy your house, but I got to sell my house, and I'm including the subject to sell the buyer's property addendum. Typically, the seller is going to reply back with, okay, cool, but we're going to include our own addendum. And what is that addendum typically? Ability to keep
Time clause.
the time clause addendum. All right, cool. We're both going to hedge our bets here a little bit. If you're going to be subject to sale of your home, right? And you all understand the language in there, right? It says if we don't get it sold by what? The later of the due diligence or the financing and appraisal deadline, we can give you notice that it hasn't happened and we get all of our earnest money back. That's kind of a tough deal for a seller to swallow. And that's why the sellers typically want something in trade or in return for that concession. And that is, cool, well, we're going to have the ability to continue to market it. And if somebody else comes in with a bona fide offer, we're going to give you notice and you've got X days or hours to remove your contingency, right? And that sounds so clean. And it should be, but let me point out to you the problem. This is the option to keep the property on the market time clause. And it says, just like I said, in section A, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. It says in section A, we as the sellers have the right to keep the property on the market. And by the way, if they do, right, so buyer and seller agree that seller may continue offer and accept any backup offers. And then the second sentence, seller, in the seller's sole discretion, may notify, not shall, may notify the buyer in writing of an accepted backup offer. So I think everybody is under the assumption that they have to, but that's not what the language says. It's at their sole discretion. We could just take it and keep it in backup position and never notify you because the second offer may be less than yours, but it is a good fallback in case you don't perform, right? So just be aware of that. They're not required to give you that backup offer. But if they do, then what? Section B. If seller does provide written notice to the buyer, then the buyer shall have X days or hours or whatever after the receipt of the written notice to provide written notice back to the seller of the buyer's removal of the following conditions from the REPC. Notice what is missing. I have it in red there. I inserted it. The default of this addendum is, well, you'll remove your due diligence, or you'll remove your appraisal, or you'll remove your financing. But, oh crap, now I'm so embarrassed. There it is. They've updated this from a while ago. Financing and, if applicable, the subject to the sale of the buyer's property condition. So now I'm just going to conveniently and quietly delete that. All right, but here's the question I have for you. It would still stand. How can you do that? I mean, on the one hand, in section 2.2, you said that you have to sell your home, right? Your existing home in order to buy this home. And now you're saying, I'm going to remove the financing condition and the subject to the buyer's property condition. Can you do that? Aren't you kind of lying? I mean, I promise you, the attorneys at UAR are smart. They wouldn't put this in here unless there's a way, but we've got to be able to speak to it. So what's the rationale there? Why can you check that box? I mean, if on the one hand, in the REPC in section 2.2, we said, yep, we have to sell our house in order to buy this. And then later on, the seller sends over notice that they've received an offer, and you, as the buyer number one, have the opportunity to remove the condition, and you're going to check number 3 and say, yep, we want notice that you're removing your subject to sell the buyer's property condition. How does that work? Or is there a problem? Come on, I want an answer.
So Matt, why can't we just circumvent all of this and use the buy before you sell program from Lifetime?
Good one, Parker. There is some truth to that. And if you don't know, I'm not going to go into it here, but our Lifetime Home Loans has tons of ridiculous programs, and they will allow somebody to assume that they sold their home and use the money from that to qualify for their new loan so they can close on this. And then, what is it, 90 days, Parker, they have to get the old one sold?
It's 90 to 120 days, but here's the cool caveat to it. I've done this like 9 times. I'm doing it right now from a home that I'm listing in Draper today for like 675, and they're buying a home for like 1.1. And they're leveraging the capital or the equity of their property to allow them to use it as a down payment on the large property so they can move into there in the next 3 weeks before they actually sell the Draper property. You have 90 days to sell it. It's the lender they use is HomeLight, who lends them this money.
Yeah.
And they give you, the realtor, 90 days to sell it, and then they buy it back from the consumer, and then they give you another 120 days to sell it after that. So
Yeah.
they give you like 7 months to be able to sell a property.
Yeah, and you know what? And commissions are still paid on it, right? So I'm glad you brought that up, Parker. I actually did not have that on my list to go through, but I hope you all understand this really is one of your values, right? And we've heard this the last 6 months. We as agents have to bring more value to the table. Well, because of our affiliation with Lifetime Home Loans, you legitimately have a significant problem-solving solution that all you have to do is be aware of it. So rather than try and just negotiate it here in the contract, you can actually circumvent it, like Parker said, by using a good product that our lender, our agent-owned lending brokerage has. So good reminder. Barring that, Parker, play ball with me here. The reason why they put this here is because, remember, there are repercussions in the subject to sell addendum. What does it say? It says, oh, let me pull it up here. Zoom in. Sorry, on my screen it looks great, but I'm sure on screen it's not. So this is the subject to sell the property, right? And there's basically 2 main sections. And, section A is your right as a buyer to cancel before due diligence, right? If the buyer has not closed on the sale of the property. Well, that's not what we're talking about here. That's pretty straightforward and clear. If you notify them before those deadlines, you get your earnest money back. Then there's the second section is, okay, well, what happens if I cancel after the deadlines, right? If you've not closed on the sale of your original home, now remember the language here, then buyer may cancel, doesn't have to cancel. So unfortunately, I'm merging 2 documents here. So the other one is saying, we're going to actually require you to accelerate that. You're either going to do a go or a no-go at this point. If we had checked in here that, yep, when we get another offer, we're going to require that you remove your financing condition, and if applicable, you're subject to sell the property. So then we go back to that addendum, and it's like, okay, so even if we were still under the protection of this section, section A, right? The fact that the seller gives us notice that they have another offer and they want us to remove contingencies makes this go away. Once you sign off saying, yep, your financing and appraisal deadline just went away when you sign off saying you're removing that condition. Okay. And so that's why they can get away with, no, you're not lying, you're not misrepresenting in the contract. They're saying, if we get to that point and we have this checked, you're going to have to say, yep, your ability to protect your earnest money just went away. Right? And it's not lying because you declared up front that you declared up front that you have to sell a home, and the seller was aware of that. And so if they give notice here that we have another one, I would hope they would have a significant amount of earnest money. If it's $2,000, I may just forfeit the $2,000 and see if I can write it out and get the deal closed and get my home sold and buy this one. But if it's, $20,000, then before sending notice saying, yeah, I'm going to remove that condition, I would probably, with $20,000 in the balance, say, nope, can't get the deal done. We're out. Go with buyer number 2. Does that make sense? So this is how these play together, and it's not misrepresenting. It's done intentionally and by design. Okay. That was a lot of ground to cover. All right, so let's go to another thing I have here on my list. I went to a broker. I went to a broker forum. Dan and I actually went, and Giselle and a couple others, but it was Salt Lake Board of Realtors annual update. They kind of did an economic update, and they also had Craig Wagner at UAR do some updates on forums. I know, right? Exciting. We're getting more changes on the forums, and I wanted to cover a few of those things really quickly. So let's jump to this. I'm going to go to slide 16. Let's start with this. So much of what we deal with in our industry is tangent to the Fed, and the Fed is trying to do what amongst a number of things. One of the biggest ones is to curb inflation. Translation: when you hear inflation, think of an engine that is getting hot. You know, you're driving down your car on your dummy gauge, and all of a sudden it's getting close to the red zone. It's hot. This is what the Fed tries to do by manipulating rates. If they raise the lending rate, they basically cool off the economy, and we get away from that red zone. Well, you can see if you look at the scale over here, this is percentage. You know, back in 2022, we're 9%. You know, we're definitely in the red zone on the economy, and that's why they're like, oh man, raise rates again, and eventually it started to take, and you can see back in mid to late 2023, it started to achieve its goal. And this yellow line is the target that they have said is kind of where they feel the economy is doing well. Not too hot, not too cold. We're cruising along. And so we're pretty dang close to their target zone. We're just a hair above 2.4%. So this is why we can say, knowing where we have been, and there's always a laggard effect, right? You change rates, and it takes, you know, a few months to a quarter to maybe even sometimes a little longer to actually get the effect on the economy. And so historically, this is what happens if you look, right? They'll do some adjustment, and then they adjust too much, and then we dip down, and then they make money cheaper, and then they wait too long, and it starts to go up. And they're not the sole cause, but they have a magnifying effect.
Matt,
And
is your next slide a comparison between this chart and housing? Because like pricing and housing or sales and housing, because those are two very different things, right? It says right there the CPI report, right? So we're talking about the consumer price index. That means the cost of goods are either getting more expensive, as in 2022, or they're now becoming less expensive, right? So that frees up more income for people to use on things that are still expensive, i.e. housing.
so, yeah, I'm not going to get into a macroeconomics discussion, Parker, because we'll lose a lot of people, because this is just one of the key indicators that the Feds use. They also use the producer price index. They also use unemployment. There's a whole amalgam of factors that they use to adjust the rates. But yes, I will come to some housing things here in just a second. And to your question, is it my next slide? They're not my slides. But no, that was not it. This was labor statistics. It's kind of related to it. Unemployment, right? When you see unemployment high, you know, you've got to do some things. Payroll employment, not unemployment. So we had massive gains in employment. You know, just as a quick frame of reference, when economists talk about full employment, what is full employment? Does that mean you have zero unemployment?
I mean, you're within that target rate of where they want to be for employment. That doesn't cause too much money to be in the marketplace, but also is not too low.
They basically say if you're at 3%, between 3 and 4% unemployment, you're actually at full employment. And so that's kind of, when they start getting around 4%, 5%, they're like, yeah, no, unemployment is just fine. All right. I have a couple other targeted ones here I wanted to show you. So go to slide 35. All right. This is specific to Utah, right? In-migration is a big deal in our state. And I thought this was interesting. We are one of the youngest states, and we do have a large population growth just because of all the young people having kids. But look at this, from 2025, 60% was natural increase and 40% was net in-migration. 8 years later, we've almost flipped that. We're 44% natural population growth, and we're getting close to 60% of net in-migration. We have a healthy environment for businesses. If you pay attention, just as an example, we all know the Silicon Slopes, right? At the point of the mountain, and how many buildings are there. I can go back to 2015, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure when in 2015, you had the stuff that was out by the golf course, 3 or 4 buildings out there, but most of this other stuff didn't exist. And now there's buildings everywhere. And they're not, they're office buildings, they're companies, Adobe went from 460,000 square feet, and they increased by another 500,000 square feet. So they're close to 1 million square feet. That means a lot of people are coming here to work. So it makes sense why our net in-migration is going up. We have a state government that is very business friendly and wants to bring people and jobs to this state. And so you're seeing it. And for us as professionals, that should be really good news, and especially with our relationship with Gold Nation, because guess where most of these people are coming from? Those states where Gold Nation exists. So if you haven't worked on fostering relationships with producers in Gold Nation, I suggest you start doing so. All right, next slide. This one was really surprising to me. This is the largest growth, right? In 2023, Utah County kicked everybody's trash. We went up 39.2% versus Salt Lake went up 24.7 versus Davis 9.1, Washington 8.2. You hear things about how fast Washington County is growing at 8.2%. Well, hell's bells, we're 5 times that. We're 5 times that. So if you come into Dan's office or to Julie Dunaway's or to my office and say, oh, I don't know, real estate is so tough right now. You're not in Biloxi, Mississippi, where there's no growth. You're in Utah County, the hottest county. Sorry, D, you're up in Davis, but there's growth up there too. My point is the entire state's growing, but if you're in Utah County, holy cow, look out. Look out. The good news is, D, you can come down here and sell all you want. There's plenty to go around.
I like Davis. We're good.
All right, next slide. This one is amazing to me. Of Utah's 9 fastest growing cities from 2010 to 2020, 5 are in Utah County. 4 are not in Utah County. That's the good news. So let's look at these. Vineyard. Notice there's no blue bar. Why? Because it didn't exist 10 years ago. It was just open fields out to the lake, kind of marshy area. And now it is it's blown up. Theaters and all kinds of stuff. Harriman, wow. Pretty significant growth, 153%. Bluffdale, 124%. Saratoga Springs, 112%. Eagle Mountain, 104%. West Haven, hey, there you go. West Haven, 63%. Lehigh, 60%. South Jordan, 54%. And Santaquin. Santaquin! I remember when Santaquin, the only thing out there was that little pond by a kind of a concrete plant. That was the only thing out there. And now, so I ran some quick numbers here. I got to look over on my screen here so Utah County in 10 years, just in those cities, that's not including all the others, but just those top 5, increased 183,494 in 10 years. you know, if you look at just a modest size city, you know, of 50,000, we basically created 3 modest sized cities in 10 years. And then if you look overall at the numbers, just in the top 9 cities in the state, 349,878 people. Right. And there's a lot of others that weren't in the top 9, top 10. If you did the top 20, we'd probably double that number or something close to it. So I just like sharing things like that. One, hopefully you can weave, if you're working in those cities, you know, that's good information for you to have, but it also should be encouraging to you as you hone your skills and are planning for the future and staying, like Parker started out with, staying engaged now through the cold months. There is a lot of activity going on, and there will be more coming in the next few months, especially as rates increase, or sorry, not increase, but get better, decrease. All right, now on to the last section. How are we doing on time? Perfect. Okay, so I just doubt you'll notice these went on the MLS at the tail end of last week. If you haven't been looking, let me just show you really quickly here. Oops. If you go to utahrealestate.com and you go to the legacy forms section, you'll see all of these red ones. These are the forms that have recently been updated. Limited agency consent. Do you remember what was changed on limited agency consent, Dan? What Craig said?
I don't remember.
The real estate purchase contract, that gets updated. The brokerage compensation agreement, the relatively new form just got updated, and the addendum to the real estate brokerage compensation agreement. Okay, so let's quickly hit a couple of these. Go back to my forms here. So the real estate brokerage compensation agreement, I'm gonna zoom in here. What people don't realize, I'm gonna give you a quick rehearsal of things. There's 2 pathways for compensation. We all know the one, it's in the REPC, right? You can put it in the REPC and the seller agrees to pay the buyer's brokerage a certain amount when the deal closes. The other way, which frankly I think is a better way just for protecting you and not having to chase your dollars, is to have a brokerage compensation agreement. Pause. I've had so many of these discussions. I don't think you need to get this compensation agreement until you're ready to write an offer. Unless it's a crazy house worth $20 million and there's a 3% commission. And so you're talking $600,000 in commission. I think before I showed that house, I'd probably get this one in place first. What I want to show you on this, no, not that one. This is the old form, but these sections still belong here. People are like, well, a seller's not going to want to sign this. I hope everybody understands the conditional nature of this. If a broker signs this, if a listing broker signs this, one, it says in contemplation of a potential real estate transaction. Then in section 5, it says condition of payment. The payment of compensation by the seller's brokerage is conditioned upon what? A successful closing of the real estate transaction between the buyer and seller, and shall be due at the closing is defined in the purchase agreement between the buyer and seller. So the safety net here is if a seller or a seller's agent signs this before getting an offer, there's literally no obligation at that point. There's no obligation. Seller doesn't have to pay anything. Only becomes an obligation if the seller accepts the buyer's offer, right? And so I've said this before, I'm going to say it one more time. So if your list price was 900,000 and your seller was really set on that, and an offer came in at, or Parker, you decided to show the house and you wanted to submit an offer, and you sent this over to me and said, hey, Matt, in section 2.2 of your ERS, how much are you authorized to advertise and bind your seller? And I say, oh, yeah, he's very generous, 3%. And Parker says, cool, before I send over an offer, I want to get a broker-to-broker compensation agreement for 3%. Are you okay with that? And me knowing my contracts, I'm like, hell yes, I'm totally happy with that. Send your offer over. right? But of course, that 3%, Parker, just for the record, right? You all know that in section 2.2, it says up to this amount, which means it's going to depend on the offer. What if Parker's offer comes in at $860,000? What's the seller naturally going to do? Aside from have a coronary.
Yeah, he's gonna look at, well, he's either gonna reject it or he's gonna.
Well, it might be a hybrid, right? He may
Sure.
say, listen, I appreciate you coming at 860. That's just not going to happen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to counter you through, because we've been talking as agents, kind of know the lay of the land. I'm going to counter you at 880. And it's, you know, I was going to pay 3% at 900,000. But since you're now going to come in at 880, I'm going to offer 2% compensation, which means we're going to do an addendum to this broker compensation agreement before I sign the REPC. Is that totally navigable? Is that easy to do? Yeah, it's new, but it's definitely not hard to do. And that's, you know, that's why I wanted to show this. The seller is not obligated until they sign the REPC. So any changes you're going to make to compensation due to a low offer or whatever else is the reason needs to be taken care of on this form or its subsequent addendum before the seller signs the REPC. Before.
What's
Yeah.
the problem? What's the problem with having one of these filled out just with the seller already signing it and putting that as document on the MLS?
It's a good question, Parker, and I'm going to give you the legal answer. The whole idea behind the national settlement was one of the legal terms that was used to get traction in the Catchmark case, right, which was the first class action, was they called it price fixing. The fact that it was already predetermined before an offer was given jumped the legal hurdle of price fixing. And so you can imagine if we have this on the MLS as an attached form, before we ever see an offer, it's the same scenario. It just changed from a BAC field on the MLS to an attached form where it was already predetermined.
Well, the difference is the up to language.
The
Right.
up to is in the ERS. Now you're bringing up a good point, and now we're starting to nerd out. So everybody pay attention. I don't want to lose you here. If you go to got so many things open here. I'm done with that one. Sure, save. Yes, save. Go away. Replace. Great. Don't need that one. No, I'm not gonna save.
Did you guys just see Matt's folder that pulled up like all the documents? If you
It's
weren't
one
just
of three, Parker.
If you weren't
It's
like
one of-
geeking out to that, if you weren't like, ooh, then why are you on this call? No.
All right, so this is the current form, and in a minute here, I'm going to show you the update. It's not a ton of updates, but here's the thing. Remember, one way to guarantee compensation is through the REPC. I'm not talking about that pathway. I'm talking about this pathway. So if I went to my seller, Parker, and I said, hey, you're going to pay me 3% here, right? For me, just my brokerage selling the property. And in 2.2, you're going to authorize me up to 3% of the gross acquisition price, right? Well, who determines, or how does this section 2.2 come into play? Well, 2.3 follows right after, and it's by design, because what it says in there is in the event that the company, not the seller, in the event the company agrees in a written compensation agreement, that would be your to broker compensation agreement, to pay a buyer's brokerage, then what? The seller has already agreed that that payment amount, as long as it doesn't exceed what's in section 2.2, will be added to the total brokerage fee they're going to pay up in 2.1, right? And this is why there is going to be a change that I'm going to show you here in a minute. But the point being, Parker, one of the discussions we had on this was when a seller authorizes you to do something, right? Let me paint a scenario here. If the seller said, hey, Matt, I authorize you to offer up to 3%, okay, in compensation. Well, if I was trying to be a super aggressive agent and really look out for my seller, and I'm like, well, I'm going to negotiate Parker put in an offer and he wants 3%. And even though I'm authorized for 3%, I'm just going to be that tough agent and I'm going to benefit my client, I'm going to negotiate 2%. And what if Parker's deal went away because of that? So there's an interesting legal doctrine called implied duties. When they say you can, and then you become the inhibitor at no instructions by the seller, they can make the case that you had an implied duty to offer the 3% to get the deal done. You with me? So whatever they offer up here, of course, I'm going to say, well, they've authorized me to advertise 3%, but I'm not going to do anything until I have a paper trail from the seller saying, yeah, based on the offer, go ahead and sign the broker compensation agreement here, even though I know that it only becomes finalized when I sign a REPSI. So this is why we don't want to put it in the MLS for the reason I explained about the national settlement and price fixing, even though we have some latitude here. If I was a practicing agent right now, the way I would position this with a seller would be this. Hey, Parker, as my seller, here's what you're going to pay me, right? And my company when we sell the house. When I talk with other agents and brokerages who represent buyers, I want you to authorize me up, 2%, 2.5%, 3%, whatever the number is. I really don't care. And I'm then going to have the discussion with them. My normal practice, Parker, is when a seller asks me, right? Even though the verbiage here says in an amount up to, right? In an amount up to this amount, my obligation as your agent is to give you the best possibility of closing on a house. So I'm going to go ahead and tell them the amount you have authorized me here, 2.5%, 3%, whatever the case may be. But here's what you need to know, Parker, as my seller. If for some reason the offer, when we receive it, isn't what we want, or you're not netting the amount, we can always come back and revise the amount that we're paying out. But as a starting place, I'm going to tell them the maximum amount that you allow me to offer. Am I doing anything wrong? Not at all. Am I being completely upfront and honest? Yes. Is it still an amount up to? It sure is. The forcing function, though, becomes the REPSI and whether we accept it or not. So I'm trying to balance the competing issues here of an implied duty to catch as many fish in my net as possible for my seller, and let him pluck out the fishes he doesn't want and make adjustments prior to accepting the REPSI. Make sense?
And Matt, you're not necessarily suggesting that this form, not this form, but the compensation form be used on every transaction, right? You're kind of suggesting that it be used more. I'm just curious. And I guess we could use it on every transaction. I've used it from time to time, but by and large, I just use the verbiage in 2.2.
Yeah, so it's a good point, and I got to get through these other documents, but I'll tell you this. The reason why I'm not a fan of the REPSI, doing commissions in the REPSI, there's nothing invalidating about it, is if the seller gets squirrely at closing and says, well, Dan didn't do a good enough job as the buyer's agent. I think he screwed things up and he put me through the ringer. Therefore, I know I agreed to pay him 3% in the REPSI. When I get to closing, I'm only signing off on 2%. How does Dan get his remaining 1%? He's got to sue. He's got to sue the seller.
Yeah.
He's got to sue the seller. That's why I'm not a fan of the REPSI in most cases. If it's here, I simply punt it to the other broker and say, you have a contract with my company. You agreed to pay 3% if you accepted a REPSI, and they accepted it. So you go chase the money. I'm not taking your seller to court. You take him to court. That's why I like this approach better as a general rule. All right, very quickly. Here is the new exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Notice we now have 4 sections, not 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. The change here was an explicit opportunity for the seller to say, seller does not authorize the company to enter into a written compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage.
Dude, I didn't know. I didn't realize my microphone was on. Dude, I
I'm glad you
read
kept
this-
it clean, Parker.
I read this the other day on a listing on another listing in Draper that I'm taking, and I was curious. I just skipped over it because I was like, yeah, I don't want that. But this does obviously require you to have a conversation about compensation with your seller instead of just saying, well, these are the fees, right? And I
Yeah.
kind of like that better because it allows you when you're doing a net sheet breakdown for your clients to say, this is what could happen if you paid compensation, and this is the increase you could bring to traffic.
Yeah, I mean, I think this
I-
really was a safety net function, Parker, just to speed this up because we're almost out of time. But basically what we had talked about, the old form basically said once they put something in 2.2, I could obligate the seller, and they'd have to pay it. And basically what happened is a few sellers got sideways with their brokerages, not realizing that that's what they were doing. And so the forms committee added one that explicitly said, oh, I as a seller, from a starting point, I can change this, but as a starting point, I'm not allowing you to do a broker to brokerage compensation agreement that obligates me. Dan.
Hey, 2.3, that's not allowing the listing brokerage to collect that additional compensation and then distribute that compensation. It's allowing us to offer that compensation. So even if the seller, whether or not they do it through the Repsy or through here, if they get squirrely, they could we're not collecting it and then giving it to the buyer's agent. So I'm not sure.
So I think I'm gonna take a different viewpoint, Dan, right? So let's start here. Unless check below, right? Unless check below. Sorry, I don't know why this is. The company may enter into a written compensation agreement to pay the buyer's brokerage, the broker
Okay,
compensation agreement, not to exceed the amount authorized. And if the company agrees to a written compensation agreement to the buyer's brokerage, then the seller does agree that the brokerage fee will be added to section 2.1.
That's
So,
great.
yeah.
That answers perfectly.
So very helpful. Notice also here that it says they added this section. This is a big one, right? Because we, as a listing agent, sometimes we get somebody, and it's more prevalent now. Buyers come in and they're like, well, I don't have an agent, so I should be able to save money, blah, 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 blah. Well, we all know on this call that we still do additional work for unrepresented buyer. You should still, if that's your scenario, please, please, please make sure you get an unrepresented buyer's disclosure. That's a great cover CYA. But the new section in here allows us to specify upfront to our seller that even if somebody comes in unrepresented, we're going to still do some work, and we're going to add a certain percentage up to 2.1, right? So if we had 3% here and we're like, yeah, it's not full blown agency relationship, but I will do a lot of chasing. So we're going to add 1% for a total of 4% in an unrepresented buyer situation. That avenue is now available to you. And I think that is a great add to this document. I'm going to highlight that. Okay. I'm not going to spend time on the limited agency consent. I will just say this. With the brokerage compensation agreement, you'll notice here, they now give us the option for gross or net. Woo! Right? Because we have we've had this multiple times since the national settlement.
Ooh.
Huh? Boo. Boo. We're helping you grease the skids, Parker. Let me give you a quick real world case. So you're under contract, or sorry, you're about ready to get an offer from somebody, and you're talking to the agent, and they say, yeah, we're going to, on your $900,000 house, we're going to offer you $900,000, but we need $30,000 in concessions, home warranties, closing costs, blah, 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 blah. And of course, we all know as listing agents, we got to go back to our seller, and the seller's going to be like, I don't freaking want to pay 3% commissions on $30,000. That's $900. And I'm not getting any value for that. So no, I don't want to pay commissions on that. So being able to check net versus gross now gives you some additional flexibility to get a deal done. Okay. And then the last thing I would say is prior to these changes in forms, if you wanted to update this, the brokerage compensation agreement, basically you had to fill out a new one. They've now created an addendum to the real estate brokerage compensation agreement. So if something needs to be changed because of an offer, you don't need to fill out a whole new form. You don't need to get some blank form and use Microsoft Word and change names and this, that. There's now a form, a blank addendum to the real estate compensation agreement. Yeah, Dan.
No, I was saying fantastic. Good deal.
Yeah. Yeah, so good news, right? There's good statistical news. We've got some good flexibility on the forms. We knew this was going to happen. You run it out there for a while. And thankfully, most of the changes I feel are very positive on this. We did ask them, they couldn't get it done before they released these last week. But I asked them if they could put a gross or a net on section 4.3E of the REPC. For the same exact reason why it's here. UAR's legal team initially said, well, it already defaults to gross, and if you want to pay net, then you can addend it. I'm like, you got to make this as simple as possible, guys. Keep your documents congruent. So put the checkbox for gross or net in section 4.3E. And they're like, you know what? That makes sense. We'll get on it. So listen, you guys are great. Thank you for being on the call. I hope you have a fantastic week. Be safe. And once you get back from Thanksgiving, hit the freaking ground running. Hit the ground running. All right. Have a good one.
Thank you,
Thanks
Matt.
for all you do, and have a good one.
Matt.
Okay,
Thanks,
see
Matt.
y'all.
Okay.